Bernard had said nothing, only raising his eyes to heaven in an angelic gaze. Saddened by the misfortunes of the Jews, remembering his old friendships with Christians, grown mannered and precious with increasing years, for reasons which the reader will learn in due course. He had now the air of a pre-Raphaelite ghost onto which hair had been incongruously grafted, like threads in the heart of an opal. "All this Dreyfus business," went on the Baron, still clasping me by the arm, "has only one drawback. It destroys society, I do not say polite society. Society has long ceased to deserve that laudatory epithet, by the influx of Mr. and Mrs. Camels and Camelries and Camelyards, astonishing creatures whom I find even in the houses of my own cousins. Because they belong to the Patrie Française, or the anti-Jewish, or some such league, as if a political opinion entitled one to any social qualification." This frivolity in M. de Charlis brought out his family likeness to the Duchesse de Guermantes. I remarked to him on the resemblance. As he appeared to think that I did not know her, I reminded him of the evening at the opera when he had seemed to be trying to avoid me. He assured me with such insistence that he had never even seen me there that I should have begun to believe him, if presently a trifling incident had not led me to think that M. de Charlis, in his excessive pride perhaps, did not care to be seen with me. "Let us return to yourself," he said, "and my plans for you. There exists among certain men, sir, a Freemasonry of which I cannot now say more than that it numbers in its ranks 4 of the reigning sovereigns of Europe. Now, the courtiers of one of these are trying to cure him of his fancy. That is a very serious matter, and may bring us to war. Yes, sir, that is a fact. You remember the story of the man who believed that he had the Princess of China shut up in a bottle. It was a form of insanity. He was cured of it. But as soon as he ceased to be mad he became merely stupid. There are maladies which we must not seek to cure because they alone protect us from others that are more serious. A cousin of mine had trouble with his stomach, he could not digest anything. The most learned specialists on the stomach treated him, with no effect. I took him to a certain doctor, another highly interesting man, by the way, of whom I could tell you a great deal. He guessed at once that the trouble was nervousness. He persuaded his patient, ordered him to eat whatever he liked quite boldly and assured him that his digestion would stand it. But my cousin had nephritis also. What the stomach can digest perfectly well the kidneys cease, after a time, to eliminate, and my cousin, instead of living to a good old age with an imaginary disease of the stomach which obliged him to keep to a diet, died at 40 with his stomach cured but his kidneys ruined. Given a very considerable advantage over people of your age, for all one knows, you will perhaps become what some eminent man of the past might have been if a good angel had revealed to him, in the midst of a humanity that knew nothing of them, the secrets of steam and electricity. Do not be foolish, do not refuse from discretion. Understand that, if I do you a great service, I expect my reward from you to be no less great. It is many years now since people in society ceased to interest me. I have but one passion left, to seek to redeem the mistakes of my life by conferring the benefit of my knowledge on a soul that is still virgin and capable of being inflamed by virtue. I have had great sorrows, sir, of which I may tell you perhaps some day. I have lost my wife, who was the loveliest, the noblest, the most perfect creature that one could dream of seeing. I have young relatives who are not, I do not say worthy, but who are not capable of accepting the moral heritage of which I have been speaking. For all I know, you may be he into whose hands it is to pass, he whose life I shall be able to direct and to raise to so lofty a plane. My own would gain in return. Perhaps in teaching you the great secrets of diplomacy I might recover a taste for them myself, and begin at last to do things of real interest in which you would have an equal share. But before I can tell I must see you often, very often, every day. I was thinking of taking advantage of this unexpected kindness on M. de Charlis's part to ask him whether he could not arrange for me to meet his sister-in-law when, suddenly, I felt my arm violently jerked, as though by an electric shock. It was M. de Charlis who had hurriedly withdrawn his arm from mine. Although as he talked he had allowed his eyes to wander in all directions, he had only just caught sight of M. d'Argencourt, who was coming towards us from a side street. On seeing us, M. d'Argencourt appeared worried, cast at me a look of distrust, almost that look intended for a creature of another race than one's own with which Madame de Guermantes had quizzed Bloch, and tried to avoid us. But one would have said that M. de Charles was determined to show him that he was not at all anxious not to be seen by him, for he called to him, simply to tell him something that was of no importance. And fearing perhaps that M. d'Argencourt had not recognized me, M. de Charles informed him that I was a great friend of Madame de Villeparisis, of the Duchesse de Guermantes, of Robert de Saint Leu, and that he himself, Charles, was an old friend of my grandmother, and glad to be able to show her grandson a little of the affection that he felt for her. Nevertheless I observed that M. d'Argencourt, albeit I had barely been introduced to him at Madame de Villeparis's, and M. de Charles had now spoken to him at great length about my family, was distinctly colder to me than he had been in the afternoon, and for a long time he showed the same aloofness whenever we met. He watched me now with a curiosity in which there was no sign of friendliness, and seemed even to have to overcome an instinctive repulsion when, on leaving us, after a moment's hesitation, he held out a hand to me which he at once withdrew. "I am sorry about that," said M. de Charles. "That fellow Argencourt, well-born but ill-bred, more than feeble as a diplomat, an impossible husband, always running after women like a person in a play, is one of those men who are incapable of understanding but perfectly capable of destroying the things in life that are really great. I hope that our friendship will be one of them, if it is ever to be formed, and I hope also that you will honor me by keeping it, as I shall, well clear of the heels of any of those donkeys who, from idleness or clumsiness or deliberate wickedness, trample upon what would seem to have been made to endure. Unfortunately, that is the mold in which most of the men one meets have been cast. The Duchesse de Guermantes seems to be very clever. We were talking this afternoon about the possibility of war. It appears that she is specially well informed on that subject." "She is nothing of the sort," replied M. de Charles tartly. "Women, and most men, for that matter, understand nothing of what I was going to tell you. My sister-in-law is a charming woman who imagines that we are still living in the days of Balzac's novels, when women had an influence on politics. Going to her house could at present have only a bad effect on you, as for that matter going anywhere. That was one of the very things I was just going to tell you when that fool interrupted me. The first sacrifice that you must make for me, I shall claim them from you in proportion to the gifts I bestow on you, is to give up going into society. It distressed me this afternoon to see you at that idiotic tea-party. You may remind me that I was there myself, but for me it was not a social gathering, it was simply a family visit. Later on, when you have established your position, if it amuses you to step down for a little into that sort of thing, it may, perhaps, do no harm. And then, I need not point out how invaluable I can be to you. The open sesame to the Guermantes house and any others that it is worth while throwing open the doors of to you, rests with me. I shall be the judge, and intend to remain master of the situation." I thought I would take advantage of what M. de Charles had said about my call on Madame de Villeparis's to try to find out what position exactly she occupied in society, but the question took another form on my lips than I had intended. And I asked him instead what the Villeparisis family was. "That is absolutely as though you had asked me what the Nobody family was," replied M. de Charles. "My aunt married, for love, A.M. Thirion, who was extremely rich, for that matter, and whose sisters had married surprisingly well, and from that day onwards he called himself Marquis de Villeparisis. It did no harm to anyone, at the most a little to himself, and very little. What his reason was I cannot tell. I suppose he was actually a Monsieur de Villeparisis, a gentleman born at Villeparisis, which as you know is the name of a little place outside Paris. My aunt tried to make out that there was such a marquisate in the family, she wanted to put things on a proper footing, I can't tell you why. When one takes a name to which one has no right, it is better not to copy the regular forms. Madame de Villeparisis being merely Madame. Tyrion completed the fall which had begun in my estimation of her when I had seen the composite nature of her party. I felt it to be unfair that a woman whose title and name were of quite recent origin should be able thus to impose upon her contemporaries, with the prospect of similarly imposing upon posterity, by virtue of her friendships with royal personages. Now that she had become once again what I had supposed her to be in my childhood, a person who had nothing aristocratic about her, these distinguished kinsfolk who gathered round her seemed to remain alien to her. She did not cease to be charming to us all. I went occasionally to see her and she sent me little presents from time to time. But I had never any impression that she belonged to the Faubourg Saint-Germain, and if I had wanted any information about it she would have been one of the last people to whom I should have applied. At present, went on M. de Charles, by going into society, you will only damage your position, warp your intellect and character. Also, you must be particularly careful in choosing your friends. Keep mistresses, if your family have no objection, that doesn't concern me, indeed I can only advise it, you young rascal who will soon have to start shaving, he rallied me, passing his fingers over my chin. But the choice of your men friends is more important. 8 out of 10 young men are little scoundrels, little wretches capable of doing you an injury which you will never be able to repair. Wait, now, my nephew Saint Loup is quite a suitable companion for you, at a pinch. As far as your future is concerned, he can be of no possible use to you, but for that I am sufficient. And really, when all's said and done, as a person to go about with, at times when you have had enough of me, he does not seem to present any serious drawback that I know of. At any rate he is a man, not one of those effeminate creatures one sees so many of nowadays, who look like little renters, and at any moment may bring their innocent victims to the gallows. I did not know the meaning of this slang word, renter. Anyone who had known it would have been as greatly surprised by his use of it as myself. People in society always like talking slang, and people against whom certain things may be hinted like to show that they are not afraid to mention them. A proof of innocence in their eyes. But they have lost their sense of proportion, they are no longer capable of realizing the point at which a certain pleasantry will become too technical, too shocking. Will be a proof rather of corruption than of simplicity. He is not like the rest of them, he has nice manners, he is really serious. I could not help smiling at this epithet, serious, to which the intonation that M. de Charles gave to it seemed to impart the sense of virtuous, of steady, as one says of a little shopgirl that she is serious. At this moment a cab passed, zigzagging along the street. A young cabman, who had deserted his box, was driving it from inside, where he lay sprawling upon the cushions, apparently half drunk. M. de Charles instantly stopped him. The driver began to argue. Which way are you going? Yours. This surprised me, for M. de Charles had already refused several cabs with similarly colored lamps. Well, I don't want to get up on the box. D'you mind if I stay down here? No, but you must put down the hood. Well, think over my proposal, said M. de Charles, preparing to leave me. I give you a few days to consider my offer, write to me. I repeat, I shall need to see you every day, and to receive from you guarantees of loyalty, of discretion which, for that matter, you do appear, I must say, to furnish. But in the course of my life I have been so often taken in by appearances that I never wish to trust them again. Damn it, it's the least you can expect that before giving up a treasure I should know into what hands it is going to pass. Very well, bear in mind what I'm offering you. You are like Hercules, though, unfortunately for yourself, you do not appear to me to have quite his muscular development, at the parting of the ways. Try not to have to regret all your life not having chosen the way that leads to virtue. Hullo, he turned to the cabman, haven't you put the hood down? I'll do it myself. I think, too, I'd better drive, seeing the state you appear to be in. He jumped in beside the cabman, took the reins, and the horse trotted off. As for myself, no sooner had I turned in at our gate than I found the pendant to the conversation which I had heard exchanged that afternoon between Bloch and M. de Norpois, but in another form, brief, inverted and cruel. This was a dispute between our butler, who believed in Dreyfus, and the Guermantes, who was an anti-Dreyfusard. The truths and counter-truths which came in conflict above ground, among the intellectuals of the rival leagues, the Patrie Française and the Droitsdel Home, were fast spreading downwards into the subsoil of popular opinion. M. Renac was manipulating, by appeals to sentiment, people whom he had never seen. While for himself the Dreyfus case simply presented itself to his reason as an incontrovertible theory which he proved in the sequel by the most astonishing victory for rational policy, a victory against France, according to some, that the world has ever seen. In 2 years he replaced a Billow by a Clemenceau ministry, revolutionized public opinion from top to bottom, took Piquart from his prison to install him, ungrateful, in the Ministry of War. Perhaps this rationalist manipulator of crowds was himself the puppet of his ancestry. When we find that the systems of philosophy which contain the most truths were dictated to their authors, in the last analysis, by reasons of sentiment, how are we to suppose that in a simple affair of politics like the Dreyfus case reasons of this order may not, unknown Tien the reasoner, have controlled his reason? Bloch believed himself to have been led by a logical sequence to choose Dreyfusism, yet he knew that his nose, skin and hair had been imposed on him by his race. Doubtless the reason enjoys more freedom, yet it obeys certain laws which it has not prescribed for itself. The case of the Guermantes butler and our own was peculiar. The waves of the two currents of Dreyfusism and anti-Dreyfusism which now divided France from end to end were, on the whole, silent, but the occasional echoes which they emitted were sincere. When you heard anyone in the middle of a conversation which was being deliberately kept off the case announce furtively some piece of political news, generally false, but always with a hopefulness of its truth, you could induce from the nature of his predictions where his heart lay. Thus there came into conflict on certain points, on one side a timid apostolate, on the other a righteous indignation. The two butlers whom I heard arguing as I came in furnished an exception to the rule. Ours let it be understood that Dreyfus was guilty, the Guermantes butler that he was innocent. This was done not to conceal their personal convictions, but from cunning, and in the keenness of their rivalry. Our butler, being uncertain whether the fresh trial would be ordered, wished beforehand, in the event of failure, to deprive the Duke's butler of the joy of seeing a just cause vanquished. The Duke's butler thought that, in the event of a refusal, ours would be more indignant at the detention on the Devil's Isle of an innocent man. The porter looked on. I had the impression that it was not he who was the cause of dissension in the Guermantes household. I went upstairs, and found my grandmother not so well. For some time past, without knowing exactly what was wrong, she had been complaining of her health. It is in moments of illness that we are compelled to recognize that we live not alone but chained to a creature of a different kingdom, whole worlds apart, who has no knowledge of us and by whom it is impossible to make ourself understood, our body. Say that we met a brigand by the way, we might yet convince him by an appeal to his personal interest, if not to our own plight. But to ask pity of our body is like discoursing before an octopus, for which our words can have no more meaning than the sound of the tides, and with which we should be appalled to find ourselves condemned to live. My grandmother's attacks passed, often enough, unnoticed by the attention which she kept always diverted to ourselves. When the pain was severe, in the hope of curing it, she would try in vain to understand what the trouble was. If the morbid phenomena of which her body was the theatre remained obscure and beyond the reach of her mind, they were clear and intelligible to certain creatures belonging to the same natural kingdom as themselves. Creatures to which the human mind has learned gradually to have recourse in order to understand what the body is saying to it. As when a foreigner accosts us we try to find someone belonging to his country who will act as interpreter. These can talk to our body, and tell us if its anger is serious or will soon be appeased. Cottard, whom we had called in to see my grandmother, and who had infuriated us by asking with a dry smile, the moment we told him that she was ill. Ill? You're sure it's not what they call a diplomatic illness? He tried to soothe his patient's restlessness by a milk diet. But incessant bowls of milk soup gave her no relief, because my grandmother sprinkled them liberally with salt, the toxic effects of which were as yet, Weidel not having made his discoveries, unknown. For, medicine being a compendium of the successive and contradictory mistakes of medical practitioners, when we summon the wisest of them to our aid, the chances are that we may be relying on a scientific truth the error of which will be recognized in a few years' time. So that to believe in medicine would be the height of folly, if not to believe in it were not greater folly still, for from this mass of errors there have emerged in the course of time many truths. Cottard had told us to take her temperature. A thermometer was fetched. Throughout almost all its length it was clear of mercury. Scarcely could one make out, crouching at the foot of the tube, in its little cell, the silver salamander. It seemed dead. The glass reed was slipped into my grandmother's mouth. We had no need to leave it there for long, the little sorceress had not been slow in casting her horoscope. We found her motionless, perched halfway up her tower, and declining to move, showing us with precision the figure that we had asked of her. A figure with which all the most careful examination that my grandmother's mind could have devoted to herself would have been incapable of furnishing her. 101 degrees. For the first time we felt some anxiety. We shook the thermometer well, to erase the ominous line, as though we were able thus to reduce the patient's fever simultaneously with the figure shown on the scale. Alas, it was only too clear that the little Sibyl, unreasoning as she was, had not pronounced judgment arbitrarily, for the next day. Scarcely had the thermometer been inserted between my grandmother's lips when almost at once, as though with a single bound, exulting in her certainty and in her intuition of a fact that to us was imperceptible, the little prophetess had come to a halt at the same point, in an implacable immobility, and pointed once again to that figure 101 with the tip of her gleaming wand. Nothing more did she tell us. In vain might we long, seek, pray, she was deaf to our entreaties. It seemed as though this were her final utterance, a warning and a menace. Then, in an attempt to constrain her to modify her response, we had recourse to another creature of the same kingdom, but more potent, which is not content with questioning the body but can command it, a febrifuge of the same order as the modern aspirin, which had not then come into use. We had not shaken the thermometer down below 99.5, and hoped that it would not have to rise from there. We made my grandmother swallow this drug and then replaced the thermometer in her mouth. Like an implacable warder to whom one presents a permit signed by a higher authority whose protecting influence one has sought, and who, finding it to be in order, replies, "Very well. I have nothing to say, if it's like that you may pass." This time the watcher in the tower did not move. But sullenly she seemed to be saying, "What use will that be to you? Since you are friends with quinine, she may give me the order not to go up, once, 10 times, 20 times. And then she will grow tired of telling me, 'I know her, get along with you. This won't last forever. And then you'll be a lot better off.'" Thereupon my grandmother felt the presence within her of a creature which knew the human body better than herself, the presence of a contemporary of the races that have vanished from the earth. The presence of Earth's first inhabitant, long anterior to the creation of thinking man. She felt that Aeonial ally who was sounding her, a little roughly even, in the head, the heart, the elbow. He found out the weak places, organized everything for the prehistoric combat which began at once to be fought. In a moment a trampled python, the fever, was vanquished by the potent chemical substance to which my grandmother, across the series of kingdoms, reaching out beyond all animal and vegetable life, would fain have been able to give thanks. And she remained moved by this glimpse which she had caught, through the mists of so many centuries, of a climate anterior to the creation even of plants. Meanwhile the thermometer, like a weird sister momentarily vanquished by some more ancient god, held motionless her silver spindle. Alas! Other inferior creatures which man has trained to the chase of the mysterious quarry which he cannot pursue within the pathless forest of himself, reported cruelly to us every day a certain quantity of albumin, not large, but constant enough for it also to appear to bear relation to some persistent malady which we could not detect. Bergotte had shocked that scrupulous instinct in me which made me subordinate my intellect, and he spoke to me of Dr. du Boulbon as of a physician who would not bore me, who would discover methods of treatment which, however strange they might appear, would adapt themselves to the singularity of my mind. But ideas transform themselves in us, they overcome the resistance with which we at first meet them, and feed upon rich intellectual reserves which we did not know to have been prepared for them. So, as happens whenever anything we have heard said about someone whom we do not know has had the faculty of awakening in us the idea of great talent, of a sort of genius. In my inmost mind I gave Dr. du Boulbon the benefit of that unlimited confidence which he inspires in us who with an eye more penetrating than other men's perceives the truth. I knew indeed that he was more of a specialist in nervous diseases, the man to whom Charcot before his death had predicted that he would reign supreme in neurology and psychiatry. Ah! I don't know about that. It's quite possible, put in Françoise, who was in the room, and heard Charcot's name, as she heard du Boulbon's, for the first time. But this in no way prevented her from saying, "It's possible." Her possibles, her perhaps, her "I don't knows," were peculiarly irritating at such a moment. One wanted to say to her, "Naturally you didn't know, since you haven't the faintest idea of what we are talking about, how can you even say whether it's possible or not, you know nothing about it. Anyhow, you can't say now that you don't know what Charcot said to du Boulbon. You do know because we have just told you, and your perhaps and possibles don't come in, because it's a fact." In spite of this more special competence in cerebral and nervous matters, as I knew that du Boulbon was a great physician, a superior man, of a profound and inventive intellect, I begged my mother to send for him, and the hope that, by a clear perception of the malady, he might perhaps cure it, carried the day finally over the fear that we had of, if we called in a specialist, alarming my grandmother. What decided my mother was the fact that, encouraged unconsciously by Cottard, my grandmother no longer went out of doors, and scarcely rose from her bed. In vain might she answer us in the words of Madame de Sévigné's letter on Madame de Lafayette, everyone said she was mad not to wish to go out. I said to these persons, so headstrong in their judgment, Madame de Lafayette is not mad, and I stuck to that. It has taken her death to prove that she was quite right not to go out. Du Boulbon when he came decided against, if not Madame de Sévigné, whom we did not quote to him, my grandmother, at any rate. Instead of sounding her chest, fixing on her steadily his wonderful eyes, in which there was perhaps the illusion that he was making a profound scrutiny of his patient, or the desire to give her that illusion, which seemed spontaneous but must be mechanically produced, or else not to let her see that he was thinking of something quite different, or simply to obtain the mastery over her, he began talking about Bergotte. "I should think so, indeed, he's magnificent, you are quite right to admire him. But which of his books do you prefer?" "Indeed? Well, perhaps that is the best after all. In any case it is the best composed of his novels. Claire is quite charming in it. Of his male characters which appeals to you most?" I supposed at first that he was making her talk like this about literature because he himself found medicine boring, perhaps also to display his breadth of mind and even, with a more therapeutic aim, to restore confidence to his patient, to show her that he was not alarmed, to take her mind from the state of her health. But afterwards I realized that, being distinguished particularly as an alienist and by his work on the brain, he had been seeking to ascertain by these questions whether my grandmother's memory was in good order. As though reluctantly he began to inquire about her past life, fixing a stern and somber eye on her. Then suddenly, as though catching sight of the truth and determined to reach it at all costs, with a preliminary rubbing of his hands, which he seemed to have some difficulty in wiping dry of the final hesitations which he himself might feel and of all the objections which we might have raised, looking down at my grandmother with a lucid eye, boldly and as though he were at last upon solid ground, punctuating his words in a quiet, impressive tone. every inflection of which bore the mark of intellect, he began. His voice, for that matter, throughout this visit remained what it naturally was, caressing. And under his bushy brows his ironical eyes were full of kindness. You will be quite well, madam, on the day, when it comes, and it rests entirely with you whether it comes today, on which you realize that there is nothing wrong with you. And resume your ordinary life. You tell me that you have not been taking your food, not going out. But, sir, I have a temperature. He laid a finger on her wrist. Not just now, at any rate. Besides, what an excuse. Don't you know that we keep out in the open air and overfeed tuberculous patients with temperatures of 102? But I have a little albumin as well. You ought not to know anything about that. You have what I have had occasion to call mental albumin. We have all of us had, when we have not been very well, little albuminous phases which our doctor has done his best to make permanent by calling our attention to them. For one disorder that doctors cure with drugs, as I am told that they do occasionally succeed in doing, they produce a dozen others in healthy subjects by inoculating them with that pathogenic agent 1,000 times more virulent than all the microbes in the world. The idea that one is ill. A belief of that sort, which has a disturbing effect on any temperament, acts with special force on neurotic people. Tell them that a shut window is open behind their back, they will begin to sneeze. Make them believe that you have put magnesia in their soup, they will be seized with colic, that their coffee is stronger than usual, they will not sleep a wink all night. Do you imagine, madam, that I needed to do any more than look into your eyes, listen to the way in which you express yourself, look, if I may say so, at this lady, your daughter, and at your grandson, who takes so much after you, to learn what was the matter with you? Your grandmother might perhaps go and sit, if the doctor allows it, in some quiet path in the Champs-Élysées, near that laurel shrubbery where you used to play when you were little. Said my mother to me, thus indirectly consulting Dr. du Boulbon, her voice for that reason assuming a tone of timid deference which it would not have had if she had been addressing me alone. The doctor turned to my grandmother and, being apparently as well read in literature as in science, adjured her as follows: Go to the Champs-Élysées, madam. To the laurel shrubbery which your grandson loves. The laurel you will find health-giving. It purifies. After he had exterminated the serpent Python, it was with a bough of laurel in his hand that Apollo made his entry into Delphi. He sought thus to guard himself from the deadly germs of the venomous monster. So you see that the laurel is the most ancient, the most venerable and, I will add, what is of therapeutic as well as of prophylactic value, the most beautiful of antiseptics. Inasmuch as a great part of what doctors know is taught them by the sick, they are easily led to believe that this knowledge which patients exhibit is common to them all. And they pride themselves on taking the patient of the moment by surprise with some remark picked up at a previous bedside. Thus it was with the superior smile of a Parisian who, in conversation with a peasant, might hope to surprise him by using suddenly a word of the local dialect that Dr. du Boulbon said to my grandmother, probably a windy night will make you sleep when the strongest soporifics would have no effect. On the contrary, sir, when the wind blows I can never sleep at all. But doctors are touchy people. ACH. Muttered du Boulbon, knitting his brows, as if someone had trodden on his toe, or as if my grandmother's sleeplessness on stormy nights were a personal insult to himself. He had not, however, an undue opinion of himself, and since, in his character as a superior person, he felt himself bound not to put any faith in medicine, he quickly recovered his philosophic serenity. My mother, in her passionate longing for reassurance from Bergot's friend, added in support of his verdict that a first cousin of my grandmother, who suffered from a nervous complaint, had lain for 7 years cloistered in her bedroom at Cambrai, without leaving her bed more than once or twice a week. You see, madam, I didn't know that, and yet I could have told you. But, sir, I am not in the least like her. On the contrary, my doctor complains that he cannot get me to stay in bed, said my grandmother, whether because she was a little annoyed by the doctor's theories. or was anxious to submit to him any objections that might be raised to them, in the hope that he would refute these and that, after he had gone. She would no longer find any doubt lurking in her own mind as to the accuracy of his encouraging diagnosis. Why, naturally, madam, you cannot have all the forms of, if you'll excuse my saying so, mania at once. You have others, but not that particular one. Yesterday I visited a home for neurasthenics. In the garden, I saw a man standing on a seat, motionless as a fakir, his neck bent in a position which must have been highly uncomfortable. On my asking him what he was doing there, he replied, without turning his head, or moving a muscle, "You see, doctor, I am extremely rheumatic and catch cold very easily. I have just been taking a lot of exercise, and while I was getting hot, like a fool, my neck was touching my flannels. If I move it away from my flannels now before letting myself cool down, I am certain to get a stiff neck, and possibly bronchitis." Which he would, in fact, have done. "You're a fine specimen of neurasthenia, that's what you are," I told him. And do you know what argument he advanced to prove that I was mistaken? It was this: that while all the other patients in the place had a mania for testing their weight, so much so that the weighing machine had to be padlocked so that they should not spend the whole day on it. He had to be lifted onto it bodily, so little did he care to be weighed. He prided himself on not sharing the mania of the others without thinking that he had also one of his own, and that it was this which saved him from the other. You must not be offended by the comparison, madam, for the man who dared not turn his neck for fear of catching a chill is the greatest poet of our day. That poor maniac is the most lofty intellect that I know. Submit to being called a neurotic. You belong to that splendid and pitiable family which is the salt of the earth. All the greatest things we know have come to us from neurotics. It is they and they only who have founded religions and created great works of art. Never will the world be conscious of how much it owes to them, nor above all of what they have suffered in order to bestow their gifts on it. We enjoy fine music, beautiful pictures, 1,000 exquisite things, but we do not know what they cost those who wrought them in sleeplessness, tears, spasmodic laughter, rashes, asthma, epilepsy. A terror of death which is worse than any of these, and which you perhaps have felt, madam, he added with a smile at my grandmother, for confess now, when I came into the room. You were not feeling very confident. You thought that you were ill, dangerously ill, perhaps. Heaven only knows what the disease was of which you thought you had detected the symptoms. And you were not mistaken, they were there. Neurosis has an absolute genius for malingering. There is no illness which it cannot counterfeit perfectly. It will produce lifelike imitations of the dilatations of dyspepsia, the sicknesses of pregnancy, the broken rhythm of the cardiac, the feverishness of the consumptive. If it is capable of deceiving the doctor, how should it fail to deceive the patient? No, no, you mustn't think I'm making fun of your sufferings. I should not undertake to heal them unless I understood them thoroughly. And, well, they say there's no good confession unless it's mutual. I have told you that without nervous trouble there can be no great artist. What is more, he added, raising a solemn forefinger, there can be no great scientist either. I will go farther, and say that, unless he himself is subject to nervous trouble, he is not, I won't say a good doctor, but I do say the right doctor to treat nervous troubles. In nervous pathology a doctor who doesn't say too many foolish things is a patient half-cured. Just as a critic is a poet who has stopped writing verse and a policeman a burglar who has retired from practice. Madam, I do not, like you, fancy myself to be suffering from albuminuria. I have not your nervous fear of food, nor of fresh air. But I can never go to sleep without getting out of bed at least 20 times to see if my door is shut. And in that home where I found the poet yesterday who would not move his neck, I had gone to secure a room. For, this is between ourselves, I spend my holidays there looking after myself when I have increased my own trouble by wearing myself out in the attempt to cure other people. But do you want me to take a cure like that, sir? Came in a frightened voice from my grandmother. It is not necessary, madam. The symptoms which you describe will vanish at my bidding. Besides, you have with you a very efficient person whom I appoint as your doctor from now onwards. That is your trouble itself, the superactivity of your nerves. Even if I knew how to cure you of that, I should take good care not to. All I need do is to control it. I see on your table there one of Bergot's books. Cured of your neurosis, you would no longer care for it. Well, I might feel it my duty to substitute for the joys that it procures for you a nervous stability which would be quite incapable of giving you those joys. But those joys themselves are a strong remedy, the strongest of all perhaps. No, I have nothing to say against your nervous energy. All I ask is that it should listen to me. I leave you in its charge. It must reverse its engines. The force which it is now using to prevent you from getting up, from taking sufficient food, let it employ in making you eat, in making you read, in making you go out, and in distracting you in every possible way. You needn't tell me that you are fatigued. Fatigue is the organic realization of a preconceived idea. Begin by not thinking it. And if ever you have a slight indisposition, which is a thing that may happen to anyone, it will be just as if you hadn't it, for your nervous energy will have endowed you with what M. de Talleyrand, in an expression full of meaning, called imaginary health. See, it has begun to cure you already. You have been sitting up in bed listening to me without once leaning back on your pillows. Your eye is bright, your complexion is good. I have been talking to you for half an hour by the clock and you have never noticed the time. Well, madam, I shall now bid you good day. When, after seeing Dr. du Boulbon to the door, I returned to the room in which my mother was by herself, the oppression that had been weighing on me for the last few weeks lifted. I felt that my mother was going to break out with a cry of joy and would see my joy. I felt that inability to endure the suspense of the coming moment at which a person is going to be overcome with emotion in our presence. Which in another category is a little like the thrill of fear that goes through one when one knows that somebody is going to come in and startle one by a door that is still closed. I tried to speak to Mama but my voice broke, and, bursting into tears, I stayed for a long time, my head on her shoulder, crying, tasting, accepting, relishing my grief. Now that I knew that it had departed from my life, as we like to exalt ourselves by forming virtuous plans which circumstances do not permit us to put into execution. Françoise annoyed me by her refusal to share in our joy. She was quite overcome because there had just been a terrible scene between the lovesick footman and the tale-bearing porter. It had required the Duchess herself, in her unfailing benevolence, to intervene, restore an apparent calm to the household and forgive the footman. For she was a good mistress, and that would have been the ideal place, if only she didn't listen to stories. During the last few days people had begun to hear of my grandmother's illness and to inquire for news of her. St. Lou had written to me, "I do not wish to take advantage of a time when your dear grandmother is unwell to convey to you what is far more than mere reproaches, on a matter with which she has no concern. But I should not be speaking the truth were I to say to you, even out of politeness, that I shall ever forget the perfidy of your conduct. Or that there can ever be any forgiveness for so scoundrelly a betrayal. But some other friends, supposing that my grandmother was not seriously ill, they may not even have known that she was ill at all, had asked me to meet them next day in the Champs-Élysées. To go with them from there to pay a call together, ending up with a dinner in the country, the thought of which appealed to me. I had no longer any reason to forego these two pleasures. When my grandmother had been told that it was now imperative, if she was to obey Dr. du Boulbon's orders, that she should go out as much as possible, she had herself at once suggested the Champs-Élysées. It would be easy for me to escort her there. And, while she sat reading, to arrange with my friends where I should meet them later, and I should still be in time, if I made haste, to take the train with them to Ville d'Avray. When the time came, my grandmother did not want to go out, she felt tired. But my mother, acting on du Boulbon's instructions, had the strength of mind to be firm and to insist on obedience. She was almost in tears at the thought that my grandmother was going to relapse again into her nervous weakness, which she might never be able to shake off. Never again would there be such a fine, warm day for an outing. The sun as it moved through the sky interspersed here and there in the broken solidity of the balcony its unsubstantial muslins, and gave to the freestone ledge a warm epidermis. An indefinite halo of gold. As Françoise had not had time to send a tube to her daughter, she left us immediately after luncheon. She very kindly consented, however, to call first at Jupien's, to get a stitch put in the cloak which my grandmother was going to wear. Returning at that moment from my morning walk I accompanied her into the shop. "Is it your young master who brings you here?" Jupien asked Françoise. "Is it you who are bringing him to see me, or is it some good wind and fortune that bring you both?" For all his want of education, Jupien respected the laws of grammar as instinctively as M. de Guermantes, in spite of every effort, broke them. With Françoise gone and the cloak mended, it was time for my grandmother to get ready. Having obstinately refused to let Mamma stay in the room with her, she took, left to herself, an endless time over her dressing, and now that I knew her to be quite well. With that strange indifference which we feel towards our relatives so long as they are alive, which makes us put everyone else before them, I felt it to be very selfish of her to take so long to risk making me late when she knew that I had an appointment with my friends and was dining at Ville d'Avray. In my impatience I finally went downstairs without waiting for her, after I had twice been told that she was just ready. At last she joined me, without apologizing to me, as she generally did, for having kept me waiting. Flushed and bothered like a person who has come to a place in a hurry and has forgotten half her belongings, just as I was reaching the half-opened glass door which, without warming them with it in the least, let in the liquid, throbbing, tepid air from the street, as though the sluices of a reservoir had been opened, between the frigid walls of the passage. "Oh, dear, if you're going to meet your friends I ought to have put on another cloak. I look rather poverty-stricken in this one." I was startled to see her so flushed, and supposed that having begun by making herself late she had had to hurry over her dressing. When we left the cab at the end of the Avenue Gabriel, in the Champs-Élysées, I saw my grandmother, without a word to me, turn aside and make her way to the little old pavilion with its green trellis, at the door of which I had once waited for Françoise. The same park keeper who had been standing there then was still talking to Françoise's marquise, when, following my grandmother who, doubtless because she was feeling sick, had her hand in front of her mouth, I climbed the steps of that little rustic theatre, erected there among the gardens. At the entrance, as in those circus booths where the clown, dressed for the ring and smothered in flour, stands at the door and takes the money himself for the seats, the marquise, at the receipt of custom, was still there in her place with her huge, uneven face smeared with a coarse plaster and her little bonnet of red flowers and black lace surmounting her auburn wig. But I do not suppose that she recognized me. The park keeper, abandoning his watch over the greenery, with the color of which his uniform had been designed to harmonize, was talking to her, on a chair by her side. "So you're still here?" he was saying. "You don't think of retiring?" "And what have I to retire for, sir? Will you kindly tell me where I shall be better off than here, where I should live more at my ease, and with every comfort? And then there's all the coming and going, plenty of distraction. My little Paris, I call it. My customers keep me in touch with everything that's going on. Just to give you an example, there's one of them who went out not more than 5 minutes ago. He's a magistrate, in the very highest position there is." "Very well, sir," she cried with ardor, as though prepared to maintain the truth of this assertion by violence, should the agent of civic authority show any sign of challenging its accuracy. "For the last 8 years, do you follow me, every day God has made, regularly on the stroke of 3 he's been here, always polite, never saying one word louder than another, never making any mess. And he stays half an hour and more to read his papers and do his little jobs. There was one day he didn't come. I never noticed it at the time, but that evening, all of a sudden I said to myself, why, that gentleman never came today, perhaps he's dead. And that gave me a regular turn, you know, because, of course, I get quite fond of people when they behave nicely. And so I was very glad when I saw him come in again next day, and I said to him, "I did. I hope there was nothing wrong yesterday, sir." Then he told me that it was his wife that had died, and he'd been so put out, poor gentleman, what with one thing and another, he hadn't been able to come. He had that really sad look, you know, people have when they've been married 25 years, and then the parting, but he seemed pleased, all the same, to be back here. You could see that all his little habits had been quite upset. I did what I could to make him feel at home. I said to him, "You mustn't let go of things, sir. Just come here the same as before, it will be a little distraction for you in your sorrow." The Marquise resumed a gentler tone, for she had observed that the guardian of groves and lawns was listening to her complacently and with no thought of contradiction, keeping harmlessly in its scabbard a sword which looked more like a horticultural implement or some symbol of a garden god. "And besides," she went on, "I choose my customers, I don't let everyone into my little parlors, as I call them. And doesn't the place just look like a parlor with all my flowers? Such friendly customers I have. There's always someone or other brings me a spray of nice lilac, or jessamine or roses, my favorite flowers, roses are." The thought that we were perhaps despised by this lady because we never brought any sprays of lilac or fine roses to her bower made me redden. And in the hope of making a bodily escape, or of being condemned only by default, from an adverse judgment, I moved towards the exit. But it is not always in this world the people who brings us fine roses to whom we are most friendly, for the Marquise, thinking that I was bored, turned to me. "You wouldn't like me to open a little place for you?" And, on my declining, "No? You're sure you won't?" she persisted, smiling. "Well, just as you please. You're welcome to it, but I know quite well, not having to pay for a thing won't make you want to do it if you don't want to." At this moment a shabbily dressed woman hurried into the place who seemed to be feeling precisely the want in question. But she did not belong to the Marquise's world, for the latter, with the ferocity of a snob, flung at her, "I've nothing disengaged, ma'am." "Will they be long?" asked the poor lady, reddening beneath the yellow flowers in her hat. "Well, ma'am, if you'll take my advice, you'll try somewhere else. You see, there are still these two gentlemen waiting, and I've only one closet, the others are out of order. Not much money there," she explained when the other had gone. "It's not the sort we want here either, they're not clean, don't treat the place with respect, it would be your humble here that would have to spend the next hour cleaning up after her ladyship. I'm not sorry to lose her penny." Finally my grandmother emerged, and feeling that she probably would not seek to atone by a lavish gratuity for the indiscretion that she had shown by remaining so long inside, I beat a retreat, so as not to have to share in the scorn which the Marquise would no doubt heap on her, and began strolling along a path, but slowly, so that my grandmother should not have to hurry to overtake me. As presently she did. "I expected her to begin, I am afraid I've kept you waiting. I hope you'll still be in time for your friends," but she did not utter a single word, so much so that, feeling a little hurt, I was disinclined to speak first. Until looking up at her I noticed that as she walked beside me she kept her face turned the other way. I was afraid that her heart might be troubling her again. I studied her more carefully and was struck by the disjointedness of her gait. Her hat was crooked, her cloak stained. She had the confused and worried look, the flushed, slightly dazed face of a person who has just been knocked down by a carriage or pulled out of a ditch. "I was afraid you were feeling sick, grandmamma. Are you feeling better now?" I asked her. Probably she thought that it would be impossible for her, without alarming me, not to make some answer. "I heard the whole of her conversation with the keeper," she told me. Could anything have been more typical of the Guermantes, or the Vergerins and their little circle? Heavens, what fine language she put it all in. And she quoted, with deliberate application, this sentence from her own special Marquise, Madame de Sévigné. As I listened to them I thought that they were preparing for me the pleasures of a farewell. Such was the speech that she made me, a speech into which she had put all her critical delicacy, her love of quotations, her memory of the classics. more thoroughly even than she would naturally have done, and as though to prove that she retained possession of all these faculties. But I guessed rather than heard what she said, so inaudible was the voice in which she muttered her sentences, clenching her teeth more than could be accounted for by the fear of being sick again. "Come," I said lightly, so as not to seem to be taking her illness too seriously, "since your heart is bothering you, shall we go home now? I don't want to trundle a grandmother with indigestion about the Champs-Élysées." "I didn't like to suggest it, because of your friends," she replied. "Poor boy. But if you don't mind, I think it would be wiser." I was afraid of her noticing the strange way in which she uttered these words. "Come," I said to her sharply, "you mustn't tire yourself talking. If your heart is bad, it's silly, wait till we get home." She smiled at me sorrowfully and gripped my hand. She had realized that there was no need to hide from me what I had at once guessed, that she had had a slight stroke. Chapter 2. Chapter 1. We made our way back along the Avenue Gabriel, through the strolling crowd. I left my grandmother to rest on a seat and went in search of a cab. She, in whose heart I always placed myself when I had to form an opinion of the most unimportant person, she was now closed to me, had become part of the world outside, and, more than from any casual passer-by, I was obliged to keep from her what I thought of her condition, to say no word of my uneasiness. I could not have spoken of it to her in greater confidence than to a stranger. She had suddenly handed back to me the thoughts, the griefs which, from the days of my infancy, I had entrusted for all time to her keeping. She was not yet dead. I was already alone. And even those allusions which she had made to the Guermantes, to Madame de Sévigné, to our conversations about the little clan, assumed an air of being without point or occasion, fantastic. Because they sprang from the nullity of this very being who tomorrow possibly would have ceased to exist, for whom they would no longer have any meaning, from that nullity. Incapable of conceiving them, which my grandmother would shortly be. "Well, sir, I don't like to say no, but you have not made an appointment, you have no time fixed. Besides, this is not my day for seeing patients. You surely have a doctor of your own. I cannot interfere with his practice, unless he were to call me in for a consultation. It's a question of professional etiquette." Just as I was signaling to a cabman, I had caught sight of the famous Professor E., almost a friend of my father and grandfather, acquainted at any rate with them both, who lived in the Avenue Gabriel, and, with a sudden inspiration, had stopped him just as he was entering his house, thinking that he would perhaps be the very person to advise my grandmother. But he was evidently in a hurry and, after calling for his letters, seemed anxious to get rid of me, so that my only chance of speaking to him lay in going up with him in the lift, of which he begged me to allow him to work the switches himself, this being a mania with him. "But, sir, I am not asking you to see my grandmother here. You will realize from what I am trying to tell you that she is not in a fit state to come. What I am asking is that you should call at our house in half an hour's time, when I have taken her home." "Call at your house? Really, sir, you must not expect me to do that. I am dining with the Minister of Commerce. I have a call to pay first. I must change at once, and to make matters worse I have torn my coat and my other one has no buttonholes for my decorations. I beg you, please, to oblige me by not touching the switches. You don't know how the lift works, one can't be too careful. Getting that buttonhole made means more delay. Well, as I am a friend of your people, if your grandmother comes here at once I will see her. But I warn you that I shall be able to give her exactly a quarter of an hour, not a moment more." I had started off at once, without even getting out of the lift which Professor E. had himself set in motion to take me down again, casting a suspicious glance at me as he did so. We may, indeed, say that the hour of death is uncertain, but when we say so we represent that hour to ourselves as situated in a vague and remote expanse of time. It never occurs to us that it can have any connection with the day that has already dawned, or may signify that death, or its first assault and partial possession of us, after which it will never leave hold of us again, may occur this very afternoon, so far from uncertain, this afternoon every hour of which has already been allotted to some occupation. You make a point of taking your drive every day so that in a month's time you will have had the full benefit of the fresh air. You have hesitated over which cloak you will take, which cabman to call. You are in the cab, the whole day lies before you, short because you have to be at home early. As a friend is coming to see you. You hope that it will be as fine again tomorrow. And you have no suspicion that death, which has been making its way towards you along another plane, shrouded in an impenetrable darkness, has chosen precisely this day of all days to make its appearance, in a few minutes' time, more or less, at the moment when the carriage has reached the Champs-Élysées. Perhaps those who are haunted as a rule by the fear of the utter strangeness of death will find something reassuring in this kind of death, in this kind of first contact with death, because death thus assumes a known, familiar guise of everyday life. A good luncheon has preceded it, and the same outing that people take who are in perfect health. A drive home in an open carriage comes on top of its first onslaught. Ill as my grandmother was, there were, after all, several people who could testify that at 6 o'clock, as we came home from the Champs-Élysées, they had bowed to her as she drove past in an open carriage, in perfect weather. Legrandin, making his way towards the Place de la Concorde, raised his hat to us, stopping to look after us with an air of surprise. I, who was not yet detached from life, asked my grandmother if she had acknowledged his greeting, reminding her of his readiness to take offense. My grandmother, thinking me no doubt very frivolous, raised her hand in the air as though to say, "What does it matter? It is not of the least importance." Yes, one might have said that, a few minutes earlier, when I was looking for a cab, my grandmother was resting on a seat in the Avenue Gabriel. And that a little later she had driven past in an open carriage. But would that have been really true? The seat, for instance, to maintain its position at the side of an avenue, for all that it may be subjected also to certain conditions of equilibrium, has no need of energy. But in order that a living person may be stable, even when supported by a seat or in a carriage, there is required a tension of forces which we do not ordinarily perceive. Any more than we perceive, because its action is universal, atmospheric pressure. Possibly if we were to be hollowed out and then left to support the pressure of the air we might feel, in the moment that preceded our extinction, that terrible weight which there was nothing left in us to neutralize. Similarly, when the abyss of sickness and death opens within us, and we have no longer any resistance to offer to the tumult with which the world and our own body rush upon us, then to endure even the tension of our own muscles, the shudder that freezes us to the marrow, then even to keep ourselves motionless in what we ordinarily regard as nothing but the simple negative position of a lifeless thing requires, if we wish our head to remain erect and our eyes calm, an expense of vital energy and becomes the object of an exhausting struggle. And if Legrandin had looked back at us with that astonished air, it was because to him, as to the other people who passed us then, in the cab in which my grandmother was apparently seated, she had seemed to be foundering, sliding into the abyss, clinging desperately to the cushions which could barely arrest the downward plunge of her body, her hair in disorder, her eye wild, unable any longer to face the assault of the images which its pupil was not strong enough now to bear. She had appeared to them, although I was still by her side, submerged in that unknown world somewhere in which she had already received the blows, traces of which she still bore when I looked up at her a few minutes earlier in the Champs-Élysées, her hat, her face, her cloak left in disorder by the hand of the invisible angel with whom she had wrestled. One have thought, since, that this moment of her stroke cannot have altogether surprised my grandmother, that indeed she had perhaps foreseen it a long time back, had lived in expectation of it. She had not known, naturally, when this fatal moment would come, had never been certain, any more than those lovers whom a similar doubt leads alternately to found unreasonable hopes and unjustified suspicions on the fidelity of their mistresses. But it is rarely that these grave maladies, like that which now at last had struck her full in the face, do not take up their abode in the sick man for a long time before killing him, during which time they make haste, like a sociable neighbor or tenant, to introduce themselves to him. A terrible acquaintance, not so much from the sufferings that it causes as from the strange novelty of the definite restriction which it imposes upon life. A woman sees herself dying, in these cases not at the actual moment of death but months, sometimes years before, when death has hideously come to dwell in her. The sufferer makes the acquaintance of the stranger whom she hears coming and going in her brain. She does not know him by sight, it is true, but from the sounds which she hears him regularly she can form an idea of his habits. Is he a criminal? One morning, she can no longer hear him. He has gone. Ah! If it were only forever! In the evening he has returned. What are his plans? Her specialist, put to the question, like an adored mistress, replies with avowals that one day are believed, another day fail to convince her. Or rather it is not the mistress's part but that of the servants one interrogates that the doctor plays. They are only third parties. The person whom we press for an answer, whom we suspect of being about to play us false, is life itself. And although we feel her to be no longer the same, we believe in her still, or at least remain undecided until the day on which she finally abandons us. I helped my grandmother into Professor E.'s lift, and a moment later he came to us and took us into his consulting room. But there, busy as he was, his bombastic manner changed, such is the force of habit, for his habit was to be friendly, that is to say lively with his patients. Since he knew that my grandmother was a great reader, and was himself one also, he devoted the first few minutes to quoting various favorite passages of poetry appropriate to the glorious summer weather. He had placed her in an armchair and himself with his back to the light so as to have a good view of her. His examination was minute and thorough, even obliging me at one moment to leave the room. He continued it after my return, then, having finished, went on, although the quarter of an hour was almost at an end, repeating various quotations to my grandmother. He even made a few jokes, which were witty enough, though I should have preferred to hear them on some other occasion, but which completely reassured me by the tone of amusement in which he uttered them. I then remembered that M. Falliers, the President of the Senate, had, many years earlier, had a false seizure. And that to the consternation of his political rivals he had returned a few days later to his duties and had begun, it was said, his preparations for a more or less remote succession to the presidency of the Republic. My confidence in my grandmother's prompt recovery was all the more complete in that, just as I was recalling the example of M. Falliers, I was distracted from following up the similarity by a shout of laughter, which served as conclusion to one of the professor's jokes. After which he took out his watch, wrinkled his brows petulantly on seeing that he was 5 minutes late, and while he bade us goodbye rang for his other coat to be brought to him at once. I waited until my grandmother had left the room, closed the door and asked him to tell me the truth. There is not the slightest hope, he informed me. It is a stroke brought on by uremia. In itself, uremia is not necessarily fatal, but this case seems to me desperate. I need not tell you that I hope I am mistaken. Anyhow, you have Cottard, you're in excellent hands. Excuse me, he broke off as a maid came into the room with his coat over her arm. I told you, I'm dining with the Minister of Commerce, and I have a call to pay first. Ah! Life is not all a bed of roses, as one is apt to think at your age. And he graciously offered me his hand. I had shut the door behind me, and a footman was showing us into the hall when we heard a loud shout of rage. The maid had forgotten to cut and hem the buttonhole for the decorations. This would take another 10 minutes. The professor continued to storm while I stood on the landing gazing at a grandmother for whom there was not the slightest hope. Each of us is indeed alone. We started for home. The sun was sinking, it burnished an interminable wall along which our cab had to pass before reaching the street in which we lived. A wall against which the shadow cast by the setting sun of horse and carriage stood out in black on a ruddy background, like a funeral car on some Pompeian terracotta. At length we arrived at the house. I made the invalid sit at the foot of the staircase in the hall, and went up to warn my mother. I told her that my grandmother had come home feeling slightly unwell, after an attack of giddiness. As soon as I began to speak, my mother's face was convulsed by the paroxysm of a despair which was yet already so resigned that I realized that for many years she had been holding herself quietly in readiness for an uncalendared but final day. She asked me no question. It seemed that, just as malevolence likes to exaggerate the sufferings of other people, so in her devotion she would not admit that her mother was seriously ill, especially with a disease which might affect the brain. Mama shuddered, her eyes wept without tears, she ran to give orders for the doctor to be fetched at once, but when Françoise asked who was ill she could not reply, her voice stuck in her throat. She came running downstairs with me, struggling to banish from her face the sob that contracted it. My grandmother was waiting below on the sofa in the hall, but, as soon as she heard us coming, drew herself together, stood up, and waved her hand cheerfully at Mama. I had partially wrapped her head in a white lace shawl, telling her that it was so that she should not catch cold on the stairs. I had hoped that my mother would not notice the change in her face, the distortion of her mouth. My precaution proved unnecessary. My mother went up to my grandmother, kissed her hand as though it were that of her god, raised her up, carried her to the lift with infinite precautions in which there was, with the fear of hurting her by any clumsy movement, the humility of one who felt herself unworthy to touch the most precious thing, to her, in the world, but never once did she raise her eyes, nor look at the sufferer's face. Perhaps this was in order that my grandmother might not be saddened by the thought that the sight of her could alarm her daughter. Perhaps from fear of a grief so piercing that she dared not face it. Perhaps from reverence, because she did not feel it permissible to herself, without impiety, to remark the trace of any mental weakening on those venerated features. Perhaps to be better able to preserve intact in her memory the image of the true face of my grandmother, radiant with wisdom and goodness. So they went up side by side, my grandmother half hidden by her shawl, my mother turning away her eyes. Meanwhile there was one person who never took hers from what could be made out of my grandmother's altered features, at which her daughter dared not look. A person who fastened on them a gaze wondering, indiscreet and of evil omen. This was Françoise. Not that she was not sincerely attached to my grandmother, indeed she had been disappointed and almost scandalized by the coldness shown by Mama, whom she would have liked to see fling herself weeping into her mother's arms, but she had a certain tendency always to look at the worst side of things. She had retained from her childhood two peculiarities which would seem to be mutually exclusive, but which when combined strengthened one another: the want of restraint common among people of humble origin who make no attempt to conceal the impression. In other words, the painful alarm aroused in them by the sight of a physical change which it would be in better taste to appear not to notice. And the unfeeling coarseness of the peasant who begins by tearing the wings off dragonflies until she is allowed to wring the necks of chickens, and lacks that modesty which would make her conceal the interest that she feels in the sight of suffering flesh. When, thanks to the faultless ministrations of Françoise, my grandmother had been put to bed, she discovered that she could speak much more easily. The little rupture or obstruction of a blood vessel which had produced the uremia having apparently been quite slight. And at once she was anxious not to fail Mama in her hour of need, to assist her in the most cruel moments through which she had yet had to pass. "Well, my child," she began, taking my mother's hand in one of her own, and keeping the other in front of her lips, so as to account for the slight difficulty which she still found in uttering certain words. "So this is all the pity you show your mother. You look as if you thought that indigestion was quite a pleasant thing." Then for the first time my mother's eyes gazed passionately into those of my grandmother, not wishing to see the rest of her face, and she replied, beginning the list of those false promises which we swear but are unable to fulfill, "Mama, you will soon be quite well again, your daughter will see to that." And embodying all her dearest love, all her determination that her mother should recover, in a kiss to which she entrusted them, and which she followed with her mind, with her whole being until it flowered upon her lips, she bent down to lay it humbly, reverently upon the precious brow. My grandmother complained of a sort of alluvial deposit of bedclothes which kept gathering all the time in the same place, over her left leg, and from which she could never manage to free herself. But she did not realize that she was herself the cause of this, so that day after day she accused Françoise unjustly of not doing her bed properly. By a convulsive movement she kept flinging to that side the whole flood of those billowing blankets of fine wool, which gathered there like the sand in a bay which is very soon transformed into a beach, unless the inhabitants construct a breakwater, by the successive deposits of the tide. My mother and I, whose falsehood was exposed before we spoke by the obnoxious perspicacity of Françoise, would not even admit that my grandmother was seriously ill. As though such an admission might give pleasure to her enemies, not that she had any, and it was more loving to feel that she was not so bad as all that. In short, from the same instinctive sentiment which had led me to suppose that André was too sorry for Albertine to be really fond of her. The same individual phenomena are reproduced in the mass, in great crises. In a war, the man who does not love his country says nothing against it, but regards it as lost, commiserates it, sees everything in the darkest colors. Françoise was of infinite value to us owing to her faculty of doing without sleep, of performing the most arduous tasks. And if, when she had gone to bed after several nights spent in the sick-room, we were obliged to call her a quarter of an hour after she had fallen asleep, she was so happy to be able to do the most tiring duties as if they had been the simplest things in the world that, so far from looking cross, her face would light up with a satisfaction tinged with modesty. Only when the time came for Mass, or for breakfast, then, had my grandmother been in her death agony, still Françoise would have quietly slipped away so as not to make herself late. She neither could nor would let her place be taken by her young footman. It was true that she had brought from Cambrai an extremely exalted idea of everyone's duty towards ourselves. She would not have tolerated that any of our servants should fail us. This doctrine had made her so noble, so imperious, so efficient an instructor that there had never come to our house any servants, however corrupted, who had not speedily purified their conception of life so far as to refuse to touch the usual commissions from tradesmen and to come rushing, however little they might previously have sought to oblige, to take from my hands and not let me tire myself by carrying the smallest package. But at Cambrai Françoise had contracted also, and had brought with her to Paris, the habit of not being able to put up with any assistance in her work. The sight of anyone coming to help her seemed to her like receiving a deadly insult. And servants had remained for weeks in the house without receiving from her any response to their morning greeting. Had even gone off on their holidays without her bidding them good-bye or their guessing her reason, which was simply and solely that they had offered to do a share of her work on some day when she had not been well. And at this moment when my grandmother was so ill, Françoise's duties seemed to her peculiarly her own. She would not allow herself, she, the official incumbent, to be done out of her part in the ritual of these festal days. And so her young footman, sent packing by her, did not know what to do with himself. And not content with having copied the butler's example and supplied himself with notepaper from my desk, had begun as well to borrow volumes of poetry from my bookshelves. He sat reading them for a good half of the day, out of admiration for the poets who had written them, but also so as, during the rest of his time, to bejem with quotations the letters which he wrote to his friends in his native village. Naturally he expected these to dazzle them. But as there was little sequence in his ideas, he had formed the notion that these poems, picked out at random from my shelves, were matters of common knowledge, to which it was customary to refer. So much so that in writing to these peasants, whose stupefaction he discounted, he interspersed his own reflections with lines from Lamartine, just as he might have said, "Who laughs last laughs longest." Or merely, "How are you keeping?" To ease her pain my grandmother was given morphine. Unfortunately, if this relieved her in other ways, it increased the quantity of albumen. The blows which we aimed at the wicked ogre who had taken up his abode in my grandmother were always wide of the mark, and it was she, her poor interposed body, that had to bear them, without her ever uttering more than a faint groan by way of complaint. And the pain that we caused her found no compensation in a benefit which we were unable to give her. The savage ogre whom we were anxious to exterminate we barely succeeded in touching, and all we did was to enrage him still further. And possibly hasten the moment at which he would devour his luckless captive. On certain days when the discharge of albumin had been excessive, Cottard, after some hesitation, stopped the morphine. In this man, so insignificant, so common, there was, in these brief moments in which he deliberated, in which the relative dangers of one and another course of treatment presented themselves alternately to his mind until he arrived at a decision, the same sort of greatness as in a general who, vulgar in all the rest of his life, is a great strategist, and in an hour of peril, after a moment's reflection, decides upon what is from the military point of view the wisest course, and gives the order, advance eastwards. Medically, however little hope there might be of setting any limit to this attack of uremia, it did not do to tire the kidneys. But, on the other hand, when my grandmother did not have morphine, her pain became unbearable. She perpetually attempted a certain movement which it was difficult for her to perform without groaning. To a great extent, suffering is a sort of need felt by the organism to make itself familiar with a new state, which makes it uneasy, to adapt its sensibility to that state. We can discern this origin of pain in the case of certain inconveniences which are not such for everyone. Into a room filled with a pungent smoke 2 men of a coarse fibre will come and attend to their business, a third, more highly strung, will betray an incessant discomfort. His nostrils will continue to sniff anxiously the odor he ought, one would say, to try not to notice but will keep on attempting to attach, by a more exact apprehension of it, to his troubled sense of smell. One consequence of which may well be that his intense preoccupation will prevent him from complaining of a toothache. When my grandmother was in pain the sweat trickled over the pink expanse of her brow, gluing to it her white locks, and if she thought that none of us was in the room she would cry out, "Oh, it's dreadful!" But if she caught sight of my mother, at once she employed all her energy in banishing from her face every sign of pain, or, an alternative stratagem, repeated the same plaints, accompanying them with explanations which gave a different sense, retrospectively, to those which my mother might have overheard. "Oh, my dear, it's dreadful to have to stay in bed on a beautiful sunny day like this when one wants to be out in the air. I am crying with rage at your orders." But she could not get rid of the look of anguish in her eyes, the sweat on her brow, the convulsive start, checked at once, of her limbs. "There is nothing wrong. I'm complaining because I'm not lying very comfortably. I feel my hair is untidy, my heart is bad, I knocked myself against the wall." And my mother, at the foot of the bed, revet to that suffering form, as though, by dint of piercing with her gaze that pain-bedewed brow, that body which hid the evil thing within it, she could have succeeded in reaching that evil thing and carrying it away. My mother said, "No, no, Mamma dear, we won't let you suffer like that, we will find something to take it away. Have patience just for a moment. Let me give you a kiss, darling. No, you're not to move." And stooping over the bed, with bended knees, almost kneeling on the ground, as though by an exercise of humility she would have a better chance of making acceptable the impassioned gift of herself, she lowered towards my grandmother her whole life contained in her face as in a ciborium which she extended over her, adorned in relief with dimples and folds so passionate, so sorrowful, so sweet that one knew not whether they had been carved by the chisel of a kiss, a sob or a smile. My grandmother, also, tried to lift up her face to Mamma's. It was so altered that probably, had she been strong enough to go out, she would have been recognized only by the feather in her hat. Her features, like the clay in a sculptor's hands, seemed to be straining, with an effort which distracted her from everything else, to conform to some particular model which we failed to identify. This business of modeling was now almost finished, and if my grandmother's face had shrunk in the process it had at the same time hardened. The veins that ran beneath its surface seemed those not of a piece of marble but of some more rugged stone. Constantly thrust forwards by the difficulty that she found in breathing and as constantly forced back onto her pillow by exhaustion, her face, worn, diminished, terribly expressive, seemed like, in a primitive, almost prehistoric carving, the rude, flushed, purplish, desperate face of some savage guardian of a tomb. But the whole task was not yet accomplished. Next, her resistance must be overcome, and that tomb, the entrance to which she had so painfully guarded, with that tense contraction, entered. In one of those moments in which, as the saying goes, one does not know what saint to invoke, as my grandmother was coughing and sneezing a good deal. We took the advice of a relative who assured us that if we sent for the specialist X, he would get rid of all that in a couple of days. People say that sort of thing about their own doctors, and their friends believe them just as Françoise always believed the advertisements in the newspapers. The specialist came with his bag packed with all the colds and coughs of his other patients, like Aeolus's bottle. My grandmother refused point-blank to let herself be examined. And we, out of consideration for the doctor, who had had his trouble for nothing, deferred to the desire that he expressed to inspect each of our noses in turn. Albeit there was nothing the matter with any of them. According to him, however, there was, everything, whether headache or colic, heart disease or diabetes, was a disease of the nose that had been wrongly diagnosed. To each of us he said, "I should like to have another look at that little cornea. Don't put it off too long. I can soon get rid of it for you with a hot needle." We were, of course, thinking of something quite different. And yet we asked ourselves, get rid of what? In a word, every one of our noses was diseased. His mistake lay only in his use of the present tense. For by the following day his examination and provisional treatment had taken effect. Each of us had his or her catarrh. And when in the street he ran into my father doubled up with a cough, he smiled to think that an ignorant layman might suppose the attack to be due to his intervention. He had examined us at a moment when we were already ill. My grandmother's illness gave occasion to various people to manifest an excess or deficiency of sympathy which surprised us quite as much as the sort of chance which led one or another of them to reveal to us connecting links of circumstances. Or of friendship for that matter, which we had never suspected. And the signs of interest shown by the people who called incessantly at the house to inquire revealed to us the gravity of an illness which, until then, we had not sufficiently detached from the countless painful impressions that we received in my grandmother's room. Summoned by telegram, her sisters declined to leave Cambrai. They had discovered a musician there who gave them excellent chamber concerts, in listening to which they thought that they could find, better than by the invalid's bedside, food for thought. A melancholy exaltation the form of which was, to say the least of it, unusual. Madame Sazerat wrote to Mamma, but in the tone of a person whom the sudden breaking off of a betrothal, the cause of the rupture being her Dreyfusism, has parted from one forever. Bergotte, on the other hand, came every day and spent several hours with me. He had always made a habit of going regularly for some time to the same house, where, accordingly, he need not stand on ceremony. But formerly it had been in order that he might talk without being interrupted. Now it was so that he might sit for as long as he chose in silence, without being expected to talk. For he was very ill, some people said with albuminuria, like my grandmother. According to another version, he had a tumor. He grew steadily weaker. It was with difficulty that he came up our staircase, with greater difficulty still that he went down it. Even though he held on to the banisters he often stumbled, and he would, I believe, have stayed at home had he not been afraid of losing altogether the habit of going out, the capacity to go out. The man with the little beard whom I had seen so alert, not very long since. He was now quite blind and even his speech was frequently obstructed. But at the same time, by a directly opposite process, the body of his work, known only to a few literary people at the period when Madame Swann used to patronize their timid efforts to disseminate it, now grown in stature and strength before the eyes of all, had acquired an extraordinary power of expansion among the general public. The general rule is, no doubt, that only after his death does a writer become famous. But it was while he still lived, and during his slow progress towards a death that he had not yet reached that this writer was able to watch the progress of his works towards renown. A dead writer can at least be illustrious without any strain on himself. The effulgence of his name is stopped short by the stone upon his grave. In the deafness of the eternal sleep he is not importuned by glory. But for Bergot the antithesis was still incomplete. He existed still sufficiently to suffer from the tumult. He was moving still, though with difficulty, while his books, bounding about him, like daughters whom one loves but whose impetuous youthfulness and noisy pleasures tire one, brought day after day to his very bedside a crowd of fresh admirers. The visits which he now began to pay us came for me several years too late, for I had no longer the same admiration for him as of old. Which is not in any sense incompatible with the growth of his reputation. A man's work seldom becomes completely understood and successful before that of another writer, still obscure, has begun in the minds of certain people more difficult to please to substitute a fresh cult for one that has almost ceased to command observance. In the books of Bergot which I constantly reread, his sentences stood out as clearly before my eyes as my own thoughts, the furniture in my room and the carriages in the street. All the details were quite easily seen, not perhaps precisely as one had always seen them, but at any rate as one was accustomed to see them now. But a new writer had recently begun to publish work in which the relations between things were so different from those that connected them for me that I could understand hardly anything of what he wrote. He would say, for instance, the hosepipes admired the smart upkeep of the roads, and so far it was simple. I followed him smoothly along those roads, which started every 5 minutes from Briand and Claudel. At that point I ceased to understand, because I had expected the name of a place and was given that of a person instead. Only I felt that it was not the sentence that was badly constructed but I myself that lacked the strength and ability necessary to reach the end. I would start afresh striving tooth and nail to climb to the pinnacle from which I would see things in their novel relations. And each time, after I had got about halfway through the sentence, I would fall back again, as later on, when I joined the army, in my attempts at the exercise known as the bridge ladder. I felt nevertheless for the new writer the admiration which an awkward boy who never receives any marks for gymnastics feels when he watches another more nimble. And from then onwards I felt less admiration for Bergot, whose limpidity began to strike me as insufficient. There was a time at which people recognized things quite easily in pictures when it was Fromentin who had painted them, and could not recognize them at all when it was Renoir. People of taste and refinement tell us nowadays that Renoir is one of the great painters of the last century. But in so saying they forget the element of time, and that it took a great deal of time, well into the present century, before Renoir was hailed as a great artist. To succeed thus in gaining recognition, the original painter, the original writer proceeds on the lines adopted by oculists. The course of treatment they give us by their painting or by their prose is not always agreeable to us. When it is at an end the operator says to us, "Now look." And, lo and behold, the world around us, which was not created once and for all, but is created afresh as often as an original artist is born, appears to us entirely different from the old world. But perfectly clear. Women pass in the street, different from what they used to be, because they are Renoirs, those Renoir types which we persistently refused to see as women. The carriages, too, are Renoirs, and the water. And the sky, we feel tempted to go for a walk in the forest which reminds us of that other which when we first saw it looked like anything in the world except a forest. Like for instance a tapestry of innumerable shades but lacking precisely the shades proper to forests. Such is the new and perishable universe which has just been created. It will last until the next geological catastrophe is precipitated by a new painter or writer of original talent. This writer who had taken Bergot's place in my affections wearied me not by the incoherence but by the novelty of associations, perfectly coherent, which my mind was not trained to follow. The fact that it was always at the same point that I felt myself relinquish my grasp pointed to a common character in the efforts that I had always to make. Moreover, when once in 1,000 times I did succeed in following the writer to the end of his sentence, what I saw there was always of a humor, a truth, a charm similar to those which I had found long ago in reading Bergot, only more delightful. I reflected that it was not so many years since a similar reconstruction of the world, like that which I was waiting now for his successor to produce, had been wrought for me by Bergotte himself. Until I was led to ask myself whether there was indeed any truth in the distinction which we are always making between art, which is no more advanced now than in Homer's day, and science with its continuous progress. Perhaps, on the contrary, art was in this respect like science. Each new writer seemed to me to have advanced beyond the stage of his immediate predecessor. And how was I to know that in 20 years' time, when I should be able to accompany without strain or effort the newcomer of today, another might not appear at whose approach he in turn would be packed off to the limbo to which his own coming would have consigned Bergotte? I spoke to the latter of the new writer. He gave me a distaste for him not so much when he said that his art was uncouth, easy and vacuous, as when he told me that he had seen him, and had almost mistaken him, so strong was the likeness, for Bloch. From that moment my friend's features outlined themselves on the printed pages, and I no longer felt any obligation to make the effort necessary to understand them. If Bergotte had decried him to me it was less, I fancy, out of jealousy for a success that was yet to come than out of ignorance of his work. He read scarcely anything. The bulk of his thought had long since passed from his brain into his books. He had grown thin, as though they had been extracted from him by surgical operations. His reproductive instinct no longer impelled him to any activity, now that he had given an independent existence to almost all his thoughts. He led the vegetative life of a convalescent, of a woman after childbirth. His fine eyes remained motionless, vaguely dazed, like the eyes of a man who lies on the sea-shore and in a vague daydream sees only each little breaking wave. However, if it was less interesting to talk to him now than I should once have found it, I felt no compunction for that. He was so far a creature of habit that the simplest habits, like the most elaborate, once he had formed them, became indispensable to him for a certain length of time. I do not know what made him come to our house first of all, but after that every day it was simply because he had been there the day before. He would come to the house as he might have gone to a café, so that no one should talk to him, so that he might, very rarely, talk himself. One might in short have found in his conduct a sign that he was moved to sympathize with us in our anxiety, or that he enjoyed my company. Had one sought to draw any conclusion from such an assiduity in calling, it did not fail to impress my mother, sensitive to everything that might be regarded as an act of homage to her invalid. And every day she reminded me, see that you don't forget to thank him nicely. We had also a discreet feminine attention like the refreshments that are brought to us in the studio, between sittings, by a painter's mistress, a courteous supplement to those which her husband paid us professionally, a visit from Madame Cottard. She came to offer us her waiting woman, or, if we preferred the services of a man, she would scour the country for one, and, best of all, on our declining, said that she did hope this was not just a put-off on our part, a word which in her world signifies a false pretext for not accepting an invitation. She assured us that the professor, who never referred to his patients when he was at home, was as sad about it as if it had been she herself who was ill. We shall see in due course that even if this had been true it would have been at once a very small and a considerable admission on the part of the most faithless and the most attentive of husbands. Offers as helpful and infinitely more touching owing to the form in which they were couched, which was a blend of the highest intelligence, the warmest sympathy, and a rare felicity of expression, were addressed to me by the hereditary Grand Duke of Luxembourg. I had met him at Balbec where he had come on a visit to one of his aunts, the Princesse de Luxembourg, being himself at that time merely Comte de Nassau. He had married, some months later, the charming daughter of another Luxembourg princess, extremely rich, because she was the only daughter of a prince who was the proprietor of an immense flour mill. Whereupon the Grand Duke of Luxembourg, who had no children of his own and was devoted to his nephew Nassau, had obtained the approval of his chamber to his declaring the young man his heir. As with all marriages of this nature, the origin of the bride's fortune was the obstacle as it was also the deciding factor. I remembered this Comte de Nassau as one of the most striking young men I had ever met, already devoured, at that time, by a dark and blazing passion for his betrothed. I was deeply touched by the letters which he wrote me, day after day, during my grandmother's illness, and Mama herself, in her emotion. Quoted sadly one of her mother's expressions, Savine would not have put it better. On the 6th day Mama, yielding to my grandmother's entreaties, left her for a little and pretended to go and lie down. I should have liked, so that my grandmother might go to sleep, Françoise to sit quite still and not disturb her by moving. In spite of my supplications, she got up and left the room. She was genuinely devoted to my grandmother. With her uncanny insight and her natural pessimism she regarded her as doomed. She would therefore have liked to pay her every possible attention. But word had just come that an electrician was in the house, one of the oldest servants of his firm, the head of which was his brother-in-law, highly esteemed throughout the building, where he had worked for many years, and especially by Jupien. This man had been ordered to come before my grandmother's illness. It seemed to me that he might have been sent away again, or told to wait. But Françoise's code of manners would not permit of this. It would have been a want of courtesy towards this worthy man. My grandmother's condition ceased at once to matter. When, after waiting a quarter of an hour, I lost my patience and went to look for her in the kitchen, I found her talking to him on the landing of the back staircase, the door of which stood open. A device which had the advantage, should any of us come on the scene, of letting it be thought that they were just saying goodbye. But had also the drawback of sending a terrible draught through the house. Françoise tore herself from the workman, not without turning to shout down after him various greetings, forgotten in her haste, to his wife and brother-in-law. A typical Cambrai scruple, not to be found wanting in politeness, which Françoise extended even to foreign politics. People foolishly imagine that the vast dimensions of social phenomena afford them an excellent opportunity to penetrate farther into the human soul. They ought, on the contrary, to realize that it is by plumbing the depths of a single personality that they might have a chance of understanding those phenomena. 1,000 times over had Françoise told the gardener at Cambrai that war was the most senseless of crimes, that life was the only thing that mattered. Yet, when the Russo-Japanese War broke out, she was quite ashamed, when she thought of the Tsar, that we had not gone to war also to help the poor Russians, since, she reminded us, we're alliance to them. She felt this abstention to be not quite polite to Nicholas II, who had always said such nice things about us. It was a corollary of the same code which would have prevented her from refusing a glass of brandy from Jupien, knowing that it would upset her digestion, and which brought it about that now. With my grandmother lying at death's door, the same meanness of which she considered France guilty in remaining neutral with regard to Japan she would have had to admit in herself. Had she not gone in person to make her apologies to this good electrician who had been put to so much trouble. Luckily for ourselves, we were soon rid of Françoise's daughter, who was obliged to be away for some weeks. To the regular stock of advice which people at Cambrai gave to the family of an invalid, you haven't tried taking him away for a little, the change of air. You know, pick up an appetite, etc. She had added the almost unique idea, which she had specially created in her own imagination, and repeated accordingly whenever we saw her, without fail. As though hoping by dint of reiteration to force it through the thickness of people's heads, she ought to have taken herself in hand radically from the first. She did not recommend any one cure rather than another, provided that it were radical. As for Françoise herself, she noticed that we were not giving my grandmother many medicines. Since, according to her, they only destroyed the stomach, she was quite glad of this, but at the same time even more humiliated. She had, in the south of France, some cousins, relatively well-to-do, whose daughter, after falling ill just as she was growing up, had died at 23. For several years the father and mother had ruined themselves on drugs, on different doctors, on pilgrimages from one watering place to another, until her decease. Now all this seemed to Françoise, for the parents in question, a kind of luxury, as though they had owned racehorses, or a place in the country. They themselves, in the midst of their affliction, derived a certain gratification from the thought of such lavish expenditure. They had now nothing left, least of all their most precious possession, their child, but they did enjoy telling people how they had done as much for her and more than the richest in the land. The ultraviolet rays to the action of which, several times a day for months on end, the poor girl had been subjected, delighted them more than anything. The father, elated in his grief by the glory of it all, was led to speak of his daughter at times as of an operatic star for whose sake he had ruined himself. Françoise was not unmoved by this wealth of scenic effect. That which framed my grandmother's sickbed seemed to her a trifle meagre, suited rather to an illness on the stage of a small provincial theatre. There came a time when her uremic trouble affected my grandmother's eyes. For some days she could not see at all. Her eyes were not at all like those of a blind person, but remained just the same as before. And I gathered that she could see nothing only from the strangeness of a certain smile of welcome which she assumed the moment one opened the door, until one had come up to her and taken her hand. A smile which began too soon and remained stereotyped on her lips, fixed, but always full-faced, and endeavoring to be visible from all points. Because she could no longer rely upon her sight to regulate it, to indicate the right moment, the proper direction, to bring it to the point. To make it vary according to the change of position or of facial expression of the person who had come in. Because it was left isolated, without the accompanying smile in her eyes which would have distracted a little from it the attention of the visitor, it assumed in its awkwardness an undue importance, giving one the impression of an exaggerated friendliness. Then her sight was completely restored, from her eyes the wandering affliction passed to her ears. For several days my grandmother was deaf. And as she was afraid of being taken by surprise by the sudden entry of someone whom she would not have heard come in, all day long, albeit she was lying with her face to the wall, she kept turning her head sharply towards the door. But the movement of her neck was clumsy, for one cannot adapt oneself in a few days to this transposition of faculties, so as, if not actually to see sounds, to listen with one's eyes. Finally her pain grew less, but the impediment of her speech increased. We were obliged to ask her to repeat almost everything that she said. And now my grandmother, realizing that we could no longer understand her, gave up altogether the attempt to speak and lay perfectly still. When she caught sight of me she gave a sort of convulsive start like a person who suddenly finds himself unable to breathe, but could make no intelligible sound. Then, overcome by her sheer powerlessness, she let her head drop onto the pillows, stretched herself out flat in her bed, her face grave, like a face of marble. Her hands motionless on the sheet or occupied in some purely physical action such as that of wiping her fingers with her handkerchief. She made no effort to think. Then came a state of perpetual agitation. She was incessantly trying to get up. But we restrained her so far as we could from doing so, for fear of her discovering how paralyzed she was. One day when she had been left alone for a moment I found her standing on the floor in her nightgown trying to open the window. At Balbec, once, when a widow who had jumped into the sea had been rescued against her will. My grandmother had told me, moved perhaps by one of those presentiments which we discern at times in the mystery, so obscure, for all that, of the organic life around us, in which nevertheless it seems that our own future is foreshadowed, that she could think of nothing so cruel as to tear a poor wretch from the death that she had deliberately sought and restore her to her living martyrdom. We were just in time to catch my grandmother. She put up an almost violent resistance to my mother, then, overpowered, seated forcibly in an armchair, she ceased to wish for death, to regret being alive. Her face resumed its impassivity and she began laboriously to pick off the hairs that had been left on her nightgown by a fur cloak which somebody had thrown over her shoulders. The look in her eyes changed completely, often uneasy, plaintive, haggard. It was no longer the look we knew, it was the sullen expression of a doddering old woman. By dint of repeatedly asking her whether she would not like her hair done, Françoise managed to persuade herself that the request had come from my grandmother. She armed herself with brushes, combs, eau de cologne, a wrapper. "It can't hurt Madame Amédée," she said to herself, "if I just comb her. Nobody's ever too ill for a good combing." In other words, one was never too weak for another person to be able, for her own satisfaction, to comb one. But when I came into the room I saw between the cruel hands of Françoise, as blissfully happy as though she were in the act of restoring my grandmother to health. Beneath a thin rain of aged tresses which had not the strength to resist the action of the comb, a head which, incapable of maintaining the position into which it had been forced, was rolling to and fro with a ceaseless swirling motion in which sheer debility alternated with spasms of pain. I felt that the moment at which Françoise would have finished her task was approaching, and I dared not hasten it by suggesting to her, "That is enough," for fear of her disobeying me. But I did forcibly intervene when, in order that my grandmother might see whether her hair had been done to her liking, Françoise, with innocent savagery, brought her a glass. I was glad for the moment that I had managed to snatch it from her in time, before my grandmother, whom we had carefully kept without a mirror, could catch even a stray glimpse of a face unlike anything she could have imagined. But, alas, when, a moment later, I leaned over her to kiss that dear forehead which had been so harshly treated, she looked up at me with a puzzled, distrustful, shocked expression. She did not know me. According to our doctor, this was a symptom that the congestion of her brain was increasing. It must be relieved in some way. Cottard was in two minds. Françoise hoped at first that they were going to apply clarified cups. She looked for the effects of this treatment in my dictionary, but could find no reference to it. Even if she had said scarified instead of clarified, she still would not have found any reference to this adjective, since she did not look any more for it under S than under C. She did indeed say clarified, but she wrote, and consequently assumed that the printed word was esclarified. Cottard, to her disappointment, gave the preference, though without much hope, to leeches. When, a few hours later, I went into my grandmother's room, fastened to her neck, her temples, her ears, the tiny black serpents were writhing among her blood-stained locks, as on the head of Medusa. But in her pale and peaceful, entirely motionless face I saw wide open, luminous and calm, her own beautiful eyes. As in days gone by, perhaps even more charged with the light of intelligence than they had been before her illness, since, as she could not speak and must not move, it was to her eyes alone that she entrusted her thought, that thought which at one time occupies an immense place in us, offering us undreamed of treasures, at another time seems reduced to nothing. Then may be reborn, as though by spontaneous generation, by the withdrawal of a few drops of blood, her eyes. Soft and liquid like two pools of oil in which the rekindled fire that was now burning lighted before the face of the invalid or reconquered universe. Her calm was no longer the wisdom of despair, but that of hope. She realized that she was better, wished to be careful, not to move, and made me the present only of a charming smile so that I should know that she was feeling better, as she gently pressed my hand. I knew the disgust that my grandmother felt at the sight of certain animals, let alone being touched by them. I knew that it was in consideration of a higher utility that she was enduring the leeches. And so it infuriated me to hear Françoise repeating to her with that laugh which people use to a baby, to make it crow, "Oh, look at the little beasties running about on Madame." This was, moreover, treating our patient with a want of respect, as though she were in her second childhood. But my grandmother, whose face had assumed the calm fortitude of a stoic, did not seem even to hear her. Alas! No sooner had the leeches been taken off than the congestion returned and grew steadily worse. I was surprised to find that at this stage, when my grandmother was so ill, Françoise was constantly disappearing. The fact was that she had ordered herself a morning dress, and did not wish to keep her dressmaker waiting. In the lives of most women, everything, even the greatest sorrow, resolves itself into a question of trying on. A few days later, when I was in bed and sleeping, my mother came to call me in the early hours of the morning. With that tender consideration which, in great crises, people who are crushed by grief show even for the slightest discomfort of others. "Forgive me for disturbing your sleep," she said to me. I was not asleep, I answered as I awoke. I said this in good faith. The great modification which the act of awakening effects in us is not so much that of introducing us to the clear life of consciousness, as that of making us lose all memory of that other, rather more diffused light in which our mind has been resting, as in the opaline depths of the sea. The tide of thought, half veiled from our perception, over which we were drifting still a moment ago, kept us in a state of motion perfectly sufficient to enable us to refer to it by the name of wakefulness. But then our actual awakenings produce an interruption of memory. A little later we describe these states as sleep because we no longer remember them. And when shines that bright star which at the moment of waking illuminates behind the sleeper the whole expanse of his sleep, it makes him imagine for a few moments that this was not a sleeping but a waking state. A shooting star, it must be added, which blots out with the fading of its light not only the false existence but the very appearance of our dream, and merely enables him who has awoken to say to himself, "I was asleep." In a voice so gentle that she seemed to be afraid of hurting me, my mother asked whether it would tire me too much to get out of bed, and, stroking my hands, went on. "My poor boy. You have only your papa and mamma to help you now." We went into the sick room. Bent in a semicircle on the bed a creature other than my grandmother, a sort of wild beast which was coated with her hair and couched amid her bedclothes lay panting, groaning, making the blankets heave with its convulsions. The eyelids were closed, and it was because the one nearer me did not shut properly, rather than because it opened at all that it left visible a chink of eye, misty, filmed, reflecting the dimness both of an organic sense of vision and of a hidden, internal pain. All this agitation was not addressed to us, whom she neither saw nor knew. But if this was only a beast that was stirring there, where could my grandmother be? Yes, I could recognize the shape of her nose, which bore no relation now to the rest of her face, but to the corner of which a beauty spot still adhered. And the hand that kept thrusting the blankets aside with a gesture which formerly would have meant that those blankets were pressing upon her, but now meant nothing. Mamma asked me to go for a little vinegar and water with which to sponge my grandmother's forehead. It was the only thing that refreshed her, thought Mamma, who saw that she was trying to push back her hair. But now one of the servants was signaling to me from the doorway. The news that my grandmother was in the last throes had spread like wildfire through the house. One of those extra helps whom people engage at exceptional times to relieve the strain on their servants, a practice which gives deathbeds an air of being social functions, had just opened the front door to the Duc de Guermantes, who was now waiting in the hall and had asked for me. I could not escape him. "I have just, my dear sir, heard your tragic news. I should like, as a mark of sympathy, to shake hands with your father." I made the excuse that I could not very well disturb him at the moment. M. de Guermantes was like a caller who turns up just as one is about to start on a journey. But he felt so intensely the importance of the courtesy he was showing us that it blinded him to all else, and he insisted upon being taken into the drawing-room. As a general rule, he made a point of going resolutely through the formalities with which he had decided to honor anyone, and took little heed that the trunks were packed or the coffin ready. "Have you sent for Dieulafoy?" "No." "That was a great mistake. And if you had only asked me, I would have got him to come. He never refuses me anything, although he has refused the Duchesse de Chartres before now. You see, I set myself above a princess of the blood. However, in the presence of death we are all equal," he added, not that he meant to suggest that my grandmother was becoming his equal, but probably because he felt that a prolonged discussion of his power over Dieulafoy and his preeminence over the Duchesse de Chartres would not be in very good taste. This advice did not in the least surprise me. I knew that, in the Guermantes set, the name of Dieulafoy was regularly quoted, only with slightly more respect, among those of other tradesmen who were quite the best in their respective lines. And the old Duchesse de Mortemart-Guermantes, I never could understand, by the way, why, the moment one speaks of a duchess, one almost invariably says, "the old Duchess of so-and-so," or, alternatively, in a delicate Watteau tone, if she is still young, "the little Duchess of so-and-so," would prescribe almost automatically, with a droop of the eyelid, in serious cases, Dieulafoy. Dieulafoy. As, if one wanted a place for ices, she would advise, Poire Blanche, or for small pastry, Ribe-tête, Ribe-tête. But I was not aware that my father had, as a matter of fact, just sent for Dieulafoy. At this point my mother, who was waiting impatiently for some cylinders of oxygen which would help my grandmother to breathe more easily, came out herself to the hall where she little expected to find M. de Guermantes. I should have liked to conceal him, had that been possible. But convinced in his own mind that nothing was more essential, could be more gratifying to her or more indispensable to the maintenance of his reputation as a perfect gentleman, he seized me violently by the arm and, although I defended myself as against an assault with repeated protestations of "Sir, sir, sir," dragged me across to Mamma, saying, "Will you do me the great honor of presenting me to your mother?" letting go a little as he came to the last word. And it was so plain to him that the honor was hers that he could not help smiling at her even while he was composing a grave face. There was nothing for it but to mention his name, the sound of which at once started him bowing and scraping, and he was just going to begin the complete ritual of salutation. He apparently proposed to enter into conversation, but my mother, overwhelmed by her grief, told me to come at once and did not reply to the speeches of M. de Guermantes who, expecting to be received as a visitor and finding himself instead left alone in the hall, would have been obliged to retire had he not at that moment caught sight of Saint Leu, who had arrived in Paris that morning and had come to us in haste to inquire for news. "I say, this is a piece of luck," cried the Duke joyfully, catching his nephew by the sleeve, which he nearly tore off, regardless of the presence of my mother who was again crossing the hall. Saint Leu was not sorry, I fancy, despite his genuine sympathy, at having missed seeing me, considering his attitude towards myself. He left the house, carried off by his uncle who, having had something very important to say to him and having very nearly gone down to Doncier's on purpose to say it, was beside himself with joy at being able to save himself so much exertion. Upon my soul, if anybody had told me I had only to cross the courtyard and I should find you here, I should have thought it a huge joke, as your friend M. Bloch would say, it's a regular farce. And as he disappeared down the stairs with Robert whom he held by the shoulder, all the same, he went on, it's quite clear I must have touched the hangman's rope or something. I do have the most astounding luck. Not that the Duc de Guermantes was ill-bred, far from it. But he was one of those men who are incapable of putting themselves in the place of other people, who resemble in that respect undertakers and the majority of doctors, and who, after composing their faces and saying, "This is a very painful occasion," after, if need be, embracing you and advising you to rest, cease to regard a deathbed or a funeral as anything but a social gathering of a more or less restricted kind at which, with a joviality that has been checked for a moment only, they scan the room in search of the person whom they can tell about their own little affairs, or ask to introduce them to someone else, or offer a lift in their carriage when it is time to go home. The Duc de Guermantes, while congratulating himself on the good wind that had blown him into the arms of his nephew, was still so surprised at the reception, natural as it was, that had been given him by my mother, that he declared later on that she was as disagreeable as my father was civil. That she had absent fits during which she seemed literally not to hear a word you said to her, and that in his opinion she had no self-possession and perhaps even was not quite all there. At the same time he had been quite prepared, according to what I was told, to put this state of mind down, in part at any rate, to the circumstances, and declared that my mother had seemed to him greatly affected by the sad event. But he had still stored up in his limbs all the residue of bows and reverences which he had been prevented from using up, and had so little idea of the real nature of Mamma's sorrow that he asked me, the day before the funeral, if I was not doing anything to distract her. A half-brother of my grandmother, who was in religion, and whom I had never seen, had telegraphed to Austria, where the head of his order was, and having as a special privilege obtained leave, arrived that day. Bowed down with grief, he sat by the bedside reading prayers and meditations from a book, without, however, taking his gimlet eyes from the invalid's face. At one point, when my grandmother was unconscious, the sight of this cleric's grief began to upset me, and I looked at him tenderly. He appeared surprised by my pity, and then an odd thing happened. He joined his hands in front of his face, like a man absorbed in painful meditation, but, on the assumption that I would then cease to watch him, left, as I observed, a tiny chink between his fingers. And at the moment when my gaze left his face, I saw his sharp eye, which had been making use of its vantage point behind his hands to observe whether my sympathy were sincere. He was hidden there as in the darkness of a confessional. He saw that I was still looking and at once shut tight the lattice which he had left ajar. I have met him again since then, but never has any reference been made by either of us to that minute. It was tacitly agreed that I had not noticed that he was spying on me. In the priest as in the alienist, there is always an element of the examining magistrate. Besides, what friend is there, however cherished, in whose and our common past there has not been some such episode which we find it convenient to believe that he must have forgotten? The doctor gave my grandmother an injection of morphine, and to make her breathing less troublesome ordered cylinders of oxygen. My mother, the doctor, the nursing sister held these in their hands. As soon as one was exhausted another was put in its place. I had left the room for a few minutes. When I returned I found myself face to face with a miracle. Accompanied on a muted instrument by an incessant murmur, my grandmother seemed to be greeting us with a long and blissful chant, which filled the room, rapid and musical. I soon realized that this was scarcely less unconscious, that it was as purely mechanical as the hoarse rattle that I had heard before leaving the room. Perhaps to a slight extent it reflected some improvement brought about by the morphine. Principally it was the result, the air not passing quite in the same way through the bronchial tubes, of a change in the register of her breathing. Released by the twofold action of the oxygen and the morphine, my grandmother's breath no longer labored, panted, groaned, but, swift and light, shot like a skater along the delicious stream. Perhaps with her breath, unconscious like that of the wind in the hollow stem of a reed, there were blended in this chant some of those more human sighs which, liberated at the approach of death, make us imagine impressions of suffering or happiness in minds which already have ceased to feel, and these sighs came now to add a more melodious accent, but without changing its rhythm, to that long phrase which rose, mounted still higher, then declined, to start forth afresh, from her unburdened bosom in quest of the oxygen. Then, having risen to so high a pitch, having been sustained with so much vigor, the chant, mingled with a murmur of supplication from the midst of her ecstasy, seemed at times to stop altogether like a spring that has ceased to flow. Françoise, in any great sorrow, felt the need but did not possess the art, as simple as that need was futile, of giving it expression. Regarding my grandmother's case as quite hopeless, it was her own personal impressions that she was impelled to communicate to us. And all that she could do was to repeat, "It makes me feel all queer," in the same tone in which she would say, when she had taken too large a plateful of cabbage broth, "It's like a load on my stomach," sensations both of which were more natural than she seemed to think. Though so feebly expressed, her grief was nevertheless very great, and was aggravated moreover by her annoyance that her daughter, detained at Cambrai, to which this young Parisian now referred as the Cambrouse, and where she felt herself growing pétreuse, in other words fossilized, would not, presumably, be able to return in time for the funeral ceremony, which was certain, Françoise felt, to be a superb spectacle. Knowing that we were not inclined to be expansive, she made Jupien promise at all costs to keep every evening in the week free. She knew that he would be engaged elsewhere at the hour of the funeral. She was determined at least to go over it all with him on his return. For several nights now my father, my grandfather and one of our cousins had been sitting up, and never left the house during the day. Their continuous devotion ended by assuming a mask of indifference. And their interminable leisure round the deathbed made them indulge in that small talk which is an inseparable accompaniment of prolonged confinement in a railway carriage. Anyhow this cousin, a nephew of my great-aunt, aroused in me an antipathy as strong as the esteem which he deserved and generally enjoyed. He was always sent for, in times of great trouble, and was so assiduous in his attentions to the dying that their mourning families, on the pretext that he was in delicate health, Despite his robust appearance, his bass voice and bristling beard invariably besought him, with the customary euphemisms, not to come to the cemetery. I could tell already that Mama, who thought of others in the midst of the most crushing grief, would soon be saying to him, in a very different form of words, what he was in the habit of hearing said on all such occasions. "Promise me that you won't come tomorrow. Please, for her sake. At any rate, you won't go all the way." It's what she would have wished. But there was nothing for it. He was always the first to arrive at the house, by reason of which he had been given, among another set, the nickname, unknown to us, of "no flowers by request." And before attending everything he had always attended to everything, which entitled him to the formula, "We don't know how to thank you." "What's that?" came in a loud voice from my grandfather, who had grown rather deaf and had failed to catch something which our cousin had just said to my father. "Nothing," answered the cousin. "I was just saying that I'd heard from Cambrai this morning. The weather is appalling down there, and here we've got too much sun." "Yet the barometer is very low," put in my father. "Where did you say the weather was bad?" asked my grandfather. "At Cambrai." "Ah. I'm not surprised. Whenever it's bad here it's fine at Cambrai, and vice versa." "Good gracious. Talking of Cambrai, has anyone remembered to tell Legrandin?" "Yes, don't worry about that, it's been done," said my cousin, whose cheeks, bronzed by an irrepressible growth of beard, dimpled faintly with the satisfaction of having remembered it. At this point my father hurried from the room. I supposed that a sudden change, for better or worse, had occurred. It was simply that Dr. Dieulafoy had just arrived. My father went to receive him in the drawing-room, like the actor who is to come next on the stage. We had sent for him not to cure but to certify, in almost a legal capacity. Dr. Dieulafoy might indeed be a great physician, a marvelous professor. To these several parts, in which he excelled, he added a third, in which he remained for 40 years without a rival, a part as original as that of the arguer, the Scaramouch or the noble father, which consisted in coming to certify an agony or a death. The mere sound of his name foreshadowed the dignity with which he would sustain the part, and when the servant announced, M. Dieulafoy, one imagined oneself at a play by Molière. To the dignity of his attitude was added, without being conspicuous, the suppleness of a perfect figure. A face in itself too good-looking was toned down by the convention due to distressing circumstances. In the sable majesty of his frock coat the professor entered the room, melancholy without affectation, uttered not the least word of condolence, which might have been thought insincere. Nor was he guilty of the slightest infringement of the rules of tact. At the foot of a deathbed it was he and not the Duc de Guermantes who was the great gentleman. Having examined my grandmother, but not so as to tire her, and with an excess of reserve which was an act of courtesy to the doctor who was treating the case, he murmured a few words to my father. Bowed respectfully to my mother, to whom I felt that my father had positively to restrain himself from saying, "Professor Dieulafoy." But already our visitor had turned away, not wishing to seem to be soliciting an introduction, and left the room in the most polished manner conceivable, simply taking with him the sealed envelope that was slipped into his hand. He had not appeared to see it, and we ourselves were left wondering for a moment whether we had really given it to him. Such a conjurer's nimbleness had he put into the act of making it vanish without thereby losing anything of the gravity, which was increased rather, of the great consultant in his long frock coat with its silken lapels, and his handsome head full of a noble commiseration. The slowness and vivacity of his movements showed that, even if he had 100 other visits to pay in patience waiting, he refused to appear hurried. For he was the embodiment of tact, intelligence and kindness. That eminent man is no longer with us. Other physicians, other professors may have rivaled, may indeed have surpassed him. But the capacity, in which his knowledge, his physical endowments, his distinguished manners made him triumph exists no longer for want of any successor capable of taking his place. Mamma had not even noticed M. Dieulafoy, everything that was not my grandmother having no existence for her. I remember, and here I anticipate, that at the cemetery, where we saw her, like a supernatural apparition, go up timidly to the grave and seem to be gazing in the wake of a flying form that was already far away. My father having remarked to her, "Old Norpoy came to the house and to the church and on here. He gave up a most important committee meeting to come. You ought really to say a word to him, he'll be so gratified if you do." My mother, when the ambassador stood before her and bowed, could do no more than gently incline a face that showed no tears. A couple of days earlier, to anticipate once again before returning to where we were just now by the bed on which my grandmother lay dying, while they were watching by the body, Françoise, who, not disbelieving entirely in ghosts, was terrified by the least sound, had said, "I believe that's her." But in place of fear it was an ineffable sweetness that her words aroused in my mother, who would have been so glad that the dead should return, to have her mother with her sometimes still. To return now to those last hours, you heard about the telegram her sister sent us? My grandfather asked the cousin. Yes, Beethoven, they told me about it, it's worth framing. Still, I'm not surprised. My poor wife, who was so fond of them, too, said my grandfather, wiping away a tear. We mustn't blame them. They're stark mad, both of them, as I've always said. What's the matter now? Aren't you going on with the oxygen? My mother spoke. Oh, but then Mama will be having more trouble with her breathing. The doctor reassured her. Oh, no. The effect of the oxygen will last a good while yet, we can begin it again presently. It seemed to me that he would not have said this of a dying woman, that if this good effect were to last it meant that we could still do something to keep her alive. The hiss of the oxygen ceased for a few moments. But the happy plaint of her breathing poured out steadily, light, troubled, unfinished, without end, beginning afresh. Now and then it seemed that all was over, her breath stopped, whether owing to one of those transpositions to another octave that occur in the breathing of a sleeper, or else from a natural interruption, an effect of unconsciousness, the progress of asphyxia, some failure of the heart. The doctor stooped to feel my grandmother's pulse, but already, as if a tributary were pouring its current into the dried riverbed, a fresh chant broke out from the interrupted measure. And the first was resumed in another pitch with the same inexhaustible force. Who knows whether, without indeed my grandmother's being conscious of them, a countless throng of happy and tender memories compressed by suffering were not escaping from her now, like those lighter gases which had long been compressed in the cylinders? One would have said that everything that she had to tell us was pouring out, that it was to us that she was addressing herself with this prolixity, this earnestness, this effusion. At the foot of the bed, convulsed by every gasp of this agony, not weeping but now and then drenched with tears, my mother presented the unreasoning desolation of a leaf which the rain lashes and the wind twirls on its stem. They made me dry my eyes before I went up to kiss my grandmother. But I thought she couldn't see anything now, said my father. One can never be sure, replied the doctor. When my lips touched her face, my grandmother's hands quivered, a long shudder ran through her whole body, reflex perhaps. Perhaps because certain affections have their hyperesthesia which recognizes through the veil of unconsciousness what they barely need senses to enable them to love. Suddenly my grandmother half rose, made a violent effort, as though struggling to resist an attempt on her life. Françoise could not endure this sight and burst out sobbing. Remembering what the doctor had just said, I tried to make her leave the room. At that moment my grandmother opened her eyes. I thrust myself hurriedly in front of Françoise to hide her tears, while my parents were speaking to the sufferer. The sound of the oxygen had ceased, the doctor moved away from the bedside. My grandmother was dead. An hour or two later Françoise was able for the last time, and without causing them any pain, to comb those beautiful tresses which had only begun to turn grey and hitherto had seemed not so old as my grandmother herself. But now on the contrary it was they alone that set the crown of age on a face grown young again, from which had vanished the wrinkles, the contractions, the swellings, the strains, the hollows which in the long course of years had been carved on it by suffering. As at the far-off time when her parents had chosen for her a bridegroom, she had the features delicately traced by purity and submission, the cheeks glowing with a chaste expectation. With a vision of happiness, with an innocent gaiety even, which the years had gradually destroyed. Life in withdrawing from her had taken with it the disillusionments of life. A smile seemed to be hovering on my grandmother's lips. On that funeral couch, death, like a sculptor of the Middle Ages, had laid her in the form of a young maiden.